The secure phone line crackled with static as President Vladimir Putin adjusted his tie in the mirror of his private study. In exactly 47 minutes, he would deliver what his inner circle believed was a routine address about economic reforms. What they didn't know was that this speech would change the course of Russian history forever. Putin had spent 3 sleepless nights crafting words that would shake the foundations of his own government. The document lay before him on the mahogany desk, its red classification stamp still wet with ink. Even his most trusted advisors had no idea what he was about to unleash upon the world. The Kremlin's corridors buzzed with their usual pre-speech energy. Security personnel performed final sweeps while camera crews made last-minute adjustments. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu chatted casually with FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov near the main entrance, both men completely unaware that their leader was about to commit what many would later call political suicide. In his study, Putin practiced the opening lines one final time. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. This wasn't fear, it was anticipation. After decades of carefully constructed power, he was about to tear down everything he had built with his own words. The speech contained admissions that would send shockwaves through every intelligence agency on Earth. Details about operations that officially never existed. Names of assets buried so deep that even the FSB's most classified files contained only fragments. Financial arrangements that connected the Kremlin to shadow networks spanning 3 continents. But that was only the beginning. At exactly 7:15 p.m. Moscow time, Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino, knocked on the study door. "Mr. President, 5 minutes until we go live." Putin nodded, slipping the speech into his jacket pocket. The television crew had already positioned their cameras in the grand hall where Putin delivered his most important addresses. The ornate Russian flags hung perfectly still in the background, soon to witness words that would make them symbols of something entirely different. As Putin walked down the marble corridor toward the filming location, his footsteps echoed with unusual resonance. Palace guards snapped to attention as he passed, their faces reflecting the same routine professionalism they showed for every presidential address. None of them suspected they were about to become witnesses to the most explosive political moment in modern Russian history. The makeup artist applied final touches to Putin's appearance while the director counted down from 60 seconds. Camera operators adjusted their focus, and sound technicians performed last-minute level checks. Everything appeared perfectly normal, exactly as it had for hundreds of previous speeches. Putin took his position behind the presidential podium, the weight of the speech in his pocket feeling heavier than any document he had ever carried. The red recording light blinked on, and millions of televisions across Russia and around the world began broadcasting what they expected to be another mundane policy announcement. "Citizens of Russia," Putin began, his voice carrying its familiar authoritative tone. "Tonight, I speak to you not as your president, but as a man who can no longer carry the burden of secrets that have defined our nation's true direction for the past 2 decades. In the control room, the director's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. This wasn't the approved script. The camera operators exchanged confused glances, but their training kept them focused on their equipment. They were broadcasting live to every major network in Russia, and there was no way to stop what was coming. Putin continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The military operations you have been told were defensive measures were, in fact, carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to test the resolve of our adversaries while securing resources that exist in territories we have never officially acknowledged entering." The first bombshell had been dropped. In living rooms across Russia, citizens slowly set down their dinner plates and leaned toward their television screens. Something was happening that had never happened before in Putin's Russia. Their leader was speaking truths that were never meant to be spoken. But no one expected what came next. The oligarchs whose wealth you have been told serves Russia's interests have, for years, been funneling resources through networks I personally established in Cyprus, Switzerland, and Dubai. These arrangements were designed not to strengthen our economy, but to ensure that certain individuals could maintain their positions regardless of Russia's actual financial stability. In the FSB headquarters building, duty officers stared at the monitors in stunned silence. Director Bortnikov's secure phone buzzed frantically, but he couldn't answer it. His attention was completely focused on the man who was systematically dismantling decades of carefully maintained state secrets. Putin pulled the speech from his pocket, no longer needing to memorize what came next. The pages rustled audibly through the microphone as he continued his devastating revelations. Operation Midnight Sun, which your intelligence services believe was terminated in 2018, has continued operating through private military contractors with direct funding from the presidential administration. The casualties reported in official documents represent less than 30% of actual losses sustained during operations that extended far beyond the geographical boundaries you have been informed of. The revelation sent shockwaves through intelligence communities worldwide. In Langley, CIA analysts who had spent years tracking fragments of Operation Midnight Sun suddenly realized they had been chasing shadows while the real operation continued under their noses. In the Kremlin's communication center, technicians desperately tried to understand why they were receiving conflicting orders. Some supervisors demanded the broadcast be terminated immediately, while others insisted it continue. The confusion created a paralysis that allowed Putin's words to continue reaching audiences across 6 time zones. The nuclear facilities you have been assured are used exclusively for energy production have, since 2019, been modified to process materials for weapons systems that exist outside all international monitoring agreements. These systems are not positioned for defensive purposes. The admission about unsanctioned nuclear activities caused immediate panic in capitals around the world. Emergency hotlines began ringing in Washington, Beijing, London, and Tel Aviv as intelligence officials tried to verify what they were hearing. Putin's voice remained remarkably steady as he continued dismantling his own government's credibility. The journalists who have disappeared over the past decade were not victims of random crimes or business disputes. Their investigations had uncovered financial connections between my administration and criminal organizations that we officially claim to oppose. Defense Minister Shoigu, who had been watching the speech from his office, grabbed his secure phone and began dialing frantically. The numbers he needed weren't responding. The entire chain of command seemed to be frozen in disbelief, unable to process that their commander-in-chief was confessing to activities that could trigger immediate international sanctions and potential military responses. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Putin looked directly into the camera with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the television screens. The financial support Russia has provided to political movements in other nations was not limited to the activities your intelligence services have discovered. We have maintained active influence operations in 17 countries, including direct funding to candidates who successfully obtained positions in foreign governments. The confession about international election interference sent emergency response teams into action across multiple continents. Phone lines buzzed with urgent communications between allies trying to assess the scope of compromised elections and political processes. In the Kremlin, Putin's security detail stood frozen in confusion. They had no protocol for a situation where their own president was voluntarily revealing state secrets that could justify immediate international retaliation. Their radio communications crackled with contradictory orders from superiors who seemed equally paralyzed by the unprecedented situation. Putin continued his systematic dismantling of Russian state secrecy. The cyber attacks attributed to independent criminal organizations were conducted by teams operating directly under FSB supervision with my explicit authorization. These operations targeted infrastructure, financial systems, and government networks in countries we publicly maintain diplomatic relations with. The revelation about state-sponsored cyber warfare provided foreign intelligence agencies with confessions they had spent billions of dollars trying to prove. In secure facilities around the world, analysts began cross-referencing Putin's admissions with their own classified findings, discovering that many of their suspicions had been significantly underestimated. As Putin approached the climax of his devastating speech, the palace staff began receiving increasingly frantic communications from government officials demanding explanations for why the broadcast hadn't been terminated. The technical crew, still operating under normal protocols, continued filming and transmitting to networks worldwide. The military equipment that has been reported as defensive upgrades represents preparation for operations that extend beyond our current area of acknowledged influence. These preparations include capabilities designed for scenarios that our diplomatic representatives have publicly stated we would never consider. The military implications of Putin's confession sent defense establishments into emergency session across NATO countries. If the Russian president was accurately describing his nation's true military capabilities and intentions, existing defense strategies would need immediate and comprehensive revision. Putin's voice carried a strange mix of relief and resignation as he approached the conclusion of his unprecedented revelation. The economic partnerships we have announced with China, Iran, and North Korea include military technology transfers and resource-sharing agreements that violate multiple international treaties Russia has signed and ratified. The admission about treaty violations provided legal justification for sanctions and diplomatic responses that had previously been politically difficult to implement. International lawyers began preparing documentation that could fundamentally alter Russia's relationship with the global community within hours. But then came the revelation that would overshadow all others. Putin paused, his eyes reflecting something between defiance and exhaustion. The succession plan that will determine Russia's leadership after my departure has been in place for 8 years. The individuals who will assume power have been selected not through any democratic process, but through arrangements that ensure the continuation of policies I have described tonight, regardless of Russia's official government structure. The confession about predetermined succession shocked even Putin's closest advisors, many of whom had believed they understood the true power structure within the Kremlin. The revelation suggested that Russia's political future had already been decided through mechanisms that existed completely outside the constitutional framework. As Putin neared the end of his speech, sirens could be heard faintly in the distance outside the Kremlin walls. Emergency response teams, both domestic and foreign, were already mobilizing based on the intelligence goldmine Putin had voluntarily provided. The protests and civil unrest that have occurred throughout Russia over the past 5 years were not organic expressions of political dissatisfaction. They were, in many cases, initiated and escalated by our own security services to justify the expansion of domestic surveillance and control measures. This final revelation about manufactured civil unrest provided the missing piece of a puzzle that had confused international observers for years. The admission suggested that Russia's internal political tensions had been deliberately orchestrated to justify increasingly authoritarian policies. Putin looked directly into the camera one last time, his expression showing a mixture of determination and something resembling relief. These admissions will have consequences that I have calculated and accepted. The Russia you wake up to tomorrow will exist in a fundamentally different relationship with the world than the Russia that existed when this broadcast began. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the millions of viewers who had witnessed the most extraordinary political confession in modern history. I have carried these secrets for too long, and the burden of maintaining these deceptions has become greater than the burden of revealing them. The television cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Putin's face as he stood silently behind the presidential podium. Then, without any closing remarks or traditional conclusion, he simply walked away from the cameras and disappeared through the same doors he had entered from. The broadcast continued for another 30 seconds, showing the empty podium and Russian flags, before technical difficulties suddenly terminated the transmission. But the damage had already been done. Every major intelligence agency in the world had recorded Putin's admissions, and the geopolitical landscape had shifted permanently in the span of a single speech. In the hours that followed, emergency sessions convened in capitals around the world as governments tried to process the implications of what they had witnessed. The speech that Putin's advisors had expected to be routine policy discussion had instead become the most consequential political address of the 21st century. Communication systems throughout the Kremlin went into chaos as officials tried to understand whether Putin had suffered some kind of breakdown, been coerced into making false statements, or had deliberately chosen to destroy his own government's credibility. The confusion created a power vacuum that would reshape Russian politics for decades to come. International markets plunged within hours as investors realized that the geopolitical assumptions underlying global economic stability had been fundamentally undermined. Currency exchanges suspended trading in Russian rubles as financial institutions tried to assess the implications of Putin's confessions for existing international agreements and partnerships. Military installations worldwide increased their alert levels as defense officials calculated the strategic implications of Putin's revelations about Russian military capabilities and intentions. The speech had provided more actionable intelligence than most nations had gathered through decades of expensive surveillance operations. By dawn the next morning, Russia existed in a completely different relationship with the international community than it had 24 hours earlier. Putin's disastrous secret speech had achieved what years of diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions had failed to accomplish. It had forced a complete re-evaluation of Russia's role in global affairs. The man who had spent decades carefully constructing an image of strength and strategic calculation had, in a single evening, voluntarily dismantled the very foundations of his power. The speech intended to reveal uncomfortable truths had instead revealed the most uncomfortable truth of all, that sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones we turn on ourselves. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Russia. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.